Tarmogoyf, a 2-mana creature whose power is equal to the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number, +1. With such mundane text, this card defied all expectations by becoming one of the most iconic format-defining cards in all of Magic the Gathering's history. But how did it rise above its seemingly mediocre, non-static stats to the juggernaut that we know it to be today? Since its release in Future Sight on May 4th, 2007, we take a look back and ask, how good was Tarmogoyf really? At first glance, Tarmogoyf doesn't seem that impressive of a creature. Its stats are reliant on what's currently in the graveyards, and even then, its stats do cap out at some point. When counting cards with different types, we find that those types include Artifact, Creature, Enchantment, Instant, Land, Planeswalker, Sorcery, and Tribal. So even assuming you hit gold and graveyards are overflowing, the Tarmogoyf will be at its best an 8-9. But if we're being honest, that's unlikely to often be the case when this card's played. So what makes it so commonly seen in decks throughout MTG's history? It all comes down to its cost. Sometimes in Magic you don't need anything more than a cheap, efficient body. And in that, Tarmogoyf was the gold standard.
One $300 hooker bot or $301 hooker bots?
At only 2 mana with a single color cost, Tarmogoyf found relevance in many standard decks at the time of its release, even being splashed off color as a cheap threat. This is how the creature was used, but how did it fare in competitive play? With its cheap cost and efficient body, Tarmogoyf quickly found homes in decks that wanted to win matches quickly. This wasn't a subtle creature. You used this card as a means to ending the game before your opponent could build up much of a response. As such, it fit beautifully in the mono-green Elves tribal deck that made several top 8 showings during the 2007 Worlds Tournament in New York. Big players like Katsuhiro Mori and Yoshitaka Nakano combine the hardy body of Tarmogoyf with staple elves such as Impervious Perfect and Ren's Run Packmaster, along with Ramp from Llanowar Elves, to build a devastating barrage of attacking creatures as quickly as possible to overrun their opponents. To help swole up their Tarmogoyf stats, spells like Eyeblade's Ending acted as a great 2 or even 3 for 1, counting as an instant and tribal and sending an opponent's creature to their graveyard. In one spell, the Tarmogoyf stats jumped by 3. And that's where the true hidden potential of Tarmogoyf was exploited, a sudden surge of strength to be added to an already overwhelming force, all for the cheap sum of 2 mana. Tarmogoyf wasn't exclusively used in just Elf tribal decks. Throughout its documented history in Standard, which lasted from May of 2007 to October of 2008, this creature would see numerous top 8 placings across major tournaments. During Nationals Australia, it was included in all 8 top 8 decks as well as taking the top 3 spots.
You call that a knife? This is a knife.
That's not a knife, that's a spoon.
All right, you win. I see you've played Knifey Spoony before.
The same was true in Nationals USA, where it starred in 10 major decks, including the top spot there. It rounded its standard format performance, taking the best deck at 15 points during Worlds 2007, cementing its place in MTG history as the king of value creatures. It seemed Tarmogoyf Mania had finally sunk its teeth into the MTG player base. This creature, who was just stats, began to pop up almost in every deck, exemplifying the outstanding versatility of this very flexible card. Without a doubt, Tarmogoyf was one of the most splashed creatures in MTG history. Have a mono blue control deck? You'll include some Tarmogoyfs for sure. How about a mid-range beatdown deck? Goyf outta here.
It's tangy like a pepper, but crunchy like
Tarmogoyf.
Almost every deck, even at a competitive level, found some way to incorporate this seemingly pedestrian creature. When at first players tried to break Tarmogoyf and get the creature as large as possible, a new philosophy crept into the player base, led by the motto, quote, just play Tarmogoyf. You didn't have to do any work to make Tarmogoyf great. As the card was, it was strong enough. Simply over the course of a normal game, cards of all types entered the graveyard, and you'd have an effortless 3-4 or 4-5 for 2 mana reliably. The design itself, no fancy combos or build-arounds or even strategy, was the source of Tarmogoyf's success. Though on October 2nd, 2008, Tarmogoyf would fatefully leave Standard, it left its mark as a card that defied normal conventions to achieve great success through the hard work of those determined to break it. But its accolades in Standard were just the beginning for Tarmogoyf, as it rotated to the format that would define its iconic status, Modern. The Modern format is where the life of many popular cards from Standard go to die, their efficacy cut low by previously printed cards that simply do their jobs, but better for cheaper. Looking at the humble Tarmogoyf, you'd be forgiven if you believe this too would be its fate. Not many only stats creatures come in and make waves in a format notorious for min-maxing the potential of decks. But again, Tarmogoyf broke the mold and redefined the Modern format. At the birth of the Modern format, Tarmogoyf was one of the most expensive cards in Standard. Typically, once a card rotates out, its demand plummets and so does its price. But moving into a format that's eternal, like Modern, ensured Tarmogoyf's high price tag so long as it was viable, and boy howdy was it viable. Just as it had shown in Standard, extending the card pool did nothing to offset the flexibility and versatility of Tarmogoyf. Simply put, there were no counterparts to what this creature did at its cost. It had no mirrors, no functional reprints, nothing. Tarmogoyf stood alone and continued to be utilized in almost any deck that could afford it. Players ran it in Twin decks, Zoo decks, and Jund, with Modern Pro Tour Tarkir being a standout competitive showing for this creature. I cannot go through each deck that placed top 8 using Tarmogoyf, there's just way too many. Just know that, undoubtedly, this creature was one of the most commonly seen in Modern decks at a competitive level. But outside of the reasons we already listed, why was Tarmogoyf so good in Modern? Because of its cost and potential size, games could end rather quickly in Modern once the first Tarmogoyf hit the field. Removal would be key in balancing things out, and a cheap creature required a cheap answer. The most commonly seen removal in Eternal formats, at the time, was Lightning Bolt. For only 1 mana and dealing 3 damage, it was really efficient. But it also often came up short against the Plague of Tarmogoyfs. With just 3 different card types in graveyards, Tarmogoyf dodged Lightning Bolt, or at least forced opponents to combine the card with other effects, scoring impressive 2-for-1 trades. There just weren't a lot of catch-all responses to this card that wouldn't hinder a deck later on, or against other threats. So with that, Tarmogoyf survived the calling of Standard and became an auto-include throughout the Modern format. Being a playset include in almost every top 8 deck, regularly placing number 1 in countless tournaments for years, well, that's going to have an effect on its demand by the player base. Modern was now the Tarmogoyf format, and its include was in reality the minimum requirement of entry into its competitive circuit. This, of course, caused a number of problems, first of which being the cost for an individual copy of the card itself. It became astronomical, unsustainable really. So much so that playsets of Tarmogoyf could run players $500 to $700, depending on if it just won big in a tournament, which it often did. Players couldn't afford this eternal staple, and its cost wasn't going down anytime soon. And eventually, people just stopped trying to break into the Modern format with the barrier of entry just being way too high. Luckily, Wizards of the Coast realized the issue of having eternal staples. Their price would only continue to skyrocket so long as their demand and availability were left unchecked. So they made the decision to reprint Tarmogoyf. Again, and again, and again. All in all, Tarmogoyf has been reprinted 6 different times. Its regular appearance in Master sets, supplementary sets meant to highlight reprints of staples in Eternal formats, did its intended job in dropping the card's price. Even still, Tarmogoyf was highly sought after and its price remained relatively high for what it was. That was until a new answer was finally printed, a card that would usher in the end of Tarmogoyf's stranglehold of the Eternal format, pushing it to near irrelevance. With the expansion Aether Revolt, a simple mono-black removal spell sent shivers down the spines of Tarmogoyf players and MTG investors alike. Fatal Push had made its triumphant debut, and immediately the survival of Tarmogoyf came into question. Where Lightning Bolt often failed in dealing with the pesky creature, Fatal Push had no such restraints, targeting the card's mana cost over its non-static stat range. Not only did Fatal Push cost a single mana, but it also wasn't just limited to exterminating opponents' Tarmogoyfs. With the Revolt mechanic, many players across Eternal formats, Modern as well as Legacy, found use for Fatal Push. It seemed the perfect solution to deal with Tarmogoyf, and the moment it rotated out of Standard, competitive play in Modern saw instant changes.
And it's gone.
What?
Sorry, yeah, that's gone.
Decks running Tarmogoyf plummeted as many players started to run Fatal Push as a counter. Even after many players started to steer away from its include, the efficacy of Fatal Push meant it now became a staple in many successful decks running black. And so long as it stayed in the competitive scene, Tarmogoyf remained on the outside looking in. That's not to say people completely abandoned the card. Players still ran it in beatdown decks with many mono-green decks, still using it as an essential part of their playstyle, simply overrunning opponents with more creatures than they could ever possibly Fatal Push. But it's also true that the popularity of Tarmogoyf would forever be impacted by the printing of Fatal Push, a slow burn end to a legacy long written in MTG history. There's no doubt that Tarmogoyf has had one of the biggest impacts a single card could ever possibly have to the history of MTG competitive play. From seemingly ordinary origins, it has shown that while fancy combos may build powerful decks, sometimes to become iconic, you simply have to be efficient. As power creep continues to ramp up in Magic the Gathering, surely Tarmogoyf will eventually meet its equal. But regardless, it's safe to say that it was and still is a really, really good card.